Hello guys, in this video we are going to learn about attacking the weak squares of your opponent. In the previous videos, we have seen some examples where the king is exposed and we have seen that there are a lot of weak squares and we have attacked on those weak squares. However, in this video we will also see examples where the king is not exposed but we identify the weak squares of the opponent and how we utilize our pieces and attack on the weak squares and crush your opponents. So in the first position, this is a very basic one. We can see that the king is exposed. So over here, what are weak squares? So if you have to define weak squares are generally the squares where your opponent's pawn cannot attack. For example, here the G file is open. So all the squares where your opponent's pawn cannot attack the piece, cannot attack the square is the weak square. For example, over here F5, the all the pawns over here, I mean all the squares over here, h3, h4, h5, they all are weak squares because the G file is empty and the pawn cannot control this square on f5. So over here you have to bring in your pieces in the weak squares and attack your opponent. The queen over here is already on h6, which is a weak square because the G file pawn is not there, so you cannot attack on h6. Now in this position it is white to move and you get the other pieces. You can play a move like knight f5, knight h5. Both these squares are weak squares because your opponent's pawn cannot attack these squares. And over here, let's say after a move like knight f5, you are going to deliver a checkmate and there is no way how your opponent can stop this. Guys, moving to the next puzzle. Over here, without wasting any time, guys, pause the video and try to find the best way how to continue as black. Well, over here it is black to move. Your rook has a great file. Your bishop on b7 is very strong. It's looking at the long diagonal. So what do you play as white, as black over here? In this position, if you found the move bishop takes f3, this is of course a great move because after g takes f3, you see that although you exchange your strong bishop for white's knight, you have exposed the white king. Now there are a lot of weak squares. For example, you can already play moves like queen to h4, knight f5, knight to f4. Your rook can jump into the attack and of course you are winning. So over here the important part was that, and also guys, over here if you came up with a move like rook to f3, this is also a great move because after, let's say, a move like g takes f3, again guys, you are going to control the weak squares. There's actually a mating sequence over here and the idea is that you get your knight over here, you get your queen to g5 and you're going to checkmate the white king because he has a lot of weak squares over here. Your pieces are going to march into his kingside territory, occupy the weak squares, take advantage of those squares and checkmate your opponent. So in these two examples we saw that how we created some weak squares in front of the white king which was exposed, but often there are also positions when your opponent's king is well defended. It has a good pawn structure in front of it, yet there are a lot of weak squares and you have to identify those weak squares and you have to attack them. So without wasting much time, let's dive into those positions. Guys, in this position it is white to move and you can see that black has a safe king. The pawn structure in front of the king is good. So what are the weak squares over here? Well, of course, when you look at this structure, weak squares are the squares where your enemy's pawn cannot attack those squares. So all the dark squares surrounding the king, the f6, the g7, the h6, all these squares, guys, are the weak squares. So pause the video and try to come up with the best way how to attack these weak squares. Now in this position, if you came up with the move knight to f6, yes, this is a good move, but the problem here is, of course, black is not going to go king h8 allowing you queen h6 immediately. He will play the move king to g7 and in this position you can see that black is now kind of defending the weak squares, and if black has a piece that is defending the weak squares, then it's not no longer a weak square. However, in this position, if you directly play the move queen to h6, this is a very strong move because now your knight is going to jump to the f6 square and black is actually defenseless. Black has no defense on how to stop this. For example, let's say black plays a move like bishop to c6. Here you go knight f6 check, and after a move like king h8, this is a forced checkmate. So over here it was important to identify the weak squares, that is the dark square surrounding the king. Now moving on to the next one. In this position it is white to move, and can you identify what is the weak squares here? Now again, you look at the king is castled, it has a good pawn structure, so basically the king is not exposed. But what are the weak squares? Once again, the dark squares surrounding the king. These are all the weak squares. And now tell me, how do you attack the weak squares? Well, over here, if you thought of some move like, let's say, queen to h6, well, over here the problem is that black can immediately play a move like pawn to f6, and now it's going to take a while for a bishop to try and come and attack the weak squares. So in this position, the best way to continue is by directly playing the move queen to f6, because now you have some ideas of bishop h6 and you're going to checkmate your opponent. So over here black can play a move knight to d8, trying to get some pieces in the attack, and after bishop h6, knight e6. Now guys, in the previous video we have learned about how to remove smart exchanges, how to remove the defender. Over here, if you came up with the move bishop takes f8, this is not the best way to continue. You do not take the exchange, but in fact the knight that is defending the g7 square, you chop off the knight, rook takes e6, and now checkmate is unavoidable. Also guys, after queen to f6, another way how to defend is to get the knight to e7. And over here also guys, the best way is you can directly play rook into e7, which is the best way, because after rook e7, now the only defense for white is to go queen c6, and you are winning a lot of material. So, and over here if you play bishop to h6 directly, after knight f5 you can still remove the defender, but this is not the best way to continue. Rather, you just take the material and you win the game. So over here guys, we saw two examples, like the first one where we saw that the dark squares are the weaknesses, and in this position again it was the dark squares that is the weakness. But let us just move one step back and let us look at this position. This is the exactly same position that we saw over here. The only difference is now this bishop, instead of the light square, it is on g7, that is the dark square, and the queen is now on e7. So now my question to you is, do you think now these squares are weak squares? Well, the answer is no, because now the bishop over here is on g7 and the bishop is controlling the dark squares. So this is not exactly a weak square. Similarly, in this position, the queen is now on e7, the bishop is now on g7. Now these squares are not weak squares because black has good defense. So the important part over here is to how to understand when is a square a weak square and when is it not. So for example, in this position we see that these squares are not attacked by your opponent's pawn, and also none of the pieces, the queen or the bishop, is being able to defend these squares. Whereas in this position, now the bishop is over here, the bishop is now guarding these two squares, so they are not exactly weak squares. So I hope you have understood the concept, how to attack the weak squares even when the king is guarding it, and also if your opponent's piece is defending those squares, they are not exactly so-called weak squares. Moving to the next position, guys, now I'm going to show you one of a very common mistakes that many players make over here. Over here it was white to move, and you can see that the knight on b4 is attacking this pawn on a7, but we have a defender over here. So this is actually taken from a live game that was played. Now in this game what happened was white took on the knight on c6, and after bishop takes c6, white became greedy at attacking the pawn over here. Now to all the people who are watching, do tell me, do you think this was a good idea by white? Because okay, you know what, over here white's king is safe, it has a good structure, the bishop over here is defending all the squares, and white is doing perfectly fine. But what happened was, after you take bishop into c6, now what happens is, ignore this pawn, already what happens is that black's bishop is now looking at this diagonal, which is a very strong bishop, and more importantly, when you look at white's position, now all these light squares, f3, g2, h3, they all become weak squares, and black is ready to pounce on these weak squares, because you know what, the queen is standing at h3, the queen can go to f3, and after black played the move knight takes a7, white simply played the move bishop takes f3, and now there is no way how white is going to stop queen h3, queen g2. If you play a move like h4, in this position already knight takes h4 is coming. You cannot take this because if you take it, there's a mate in 2 coming, and white lost the game. So over here, it is important to understand the concept of weak squares, and of course, what white saw over here is that after even a move like rook, let's say after this, the knight is not getting trapped because the knight can always come back to b4. But the point is that you need to understand the concept of weak squares. Had white, the player playing white, had he seen this video, he would have understood the concept of weak squares, that this bishop here is a very important piece because it is guarding all the squares over here, and the bishop is actually the piece which is making the white king look safe. But when you remove the bishop over here, now all these squares become weak, and you know what, black is ready to pounce on it and attack and simply crush him. Coming to the final position of this video, guys, it is black to move. Do try and find the best way to continue. Now, first of all, when we look at this position, the black king is safe, the pawn structure is good, the bishop is there on a6, and there are no as such weak squares. But when you look at the white's king, the pawns are all marched forward, and given this structure, one of the biggest weaknesses that white has is all these light squares over here. You know, all the light squares in front of the white king, they all are weak squares. So in this position, if you came up with some ideas like, rook to h6, rook to g6, hitting the pawn on g3, or some moves like, rook d to g8, trying to push g5, well, these are definitely good ideas and they are very interesting ones. But in this position, again, the light squares are so weak that it makes sense to directly pounce on those light squares because you have a very strong bishop, a light squared bishop. So in this position, the best move is to immediately go bishop to d3. You are hitting the rook over here. After a move like rook to a1, you go bishop e4. Again, putting your bishop on the light square, hitting all these squares, f3, g2, h3, and now queen f2 is the only move. And now, guys, we have learned the first principle of attacking. What do? Get all your pieces in the attack. So what do you play? You move the rook to h6. The idea is to come to g6 and attack the pawn on g3, which is of course a weak pawn. King h2, trying to defend the pawn. Over here, rook g1 is like one of the ways how you can defend this pawn. And now, guys, over here, the important part is look at this structure, and in positions like this, you can already start off some ideas. So in this position, black plays a move like knight to h6. The idea is to go to g4, forking the king and the queen. Now, to stop this, white has to move his queen, and queen e2 is the only logical move. And now what do? Bring your pieces in the attack, occupy the weak squares, knight to g4 check. Giving a check, there's only one square for the king, king to h3. And now how do you finish off the attack? Well, you get all your pieces in the attack, and which is the piece that you get into the attack? The strongest and the mightiest of them all, the queen. You play the beautiful move queen to e6. Now what is the idea? You want to play knight to f2 check. I mean, the idea is that you go knight f2 check, and after king h2, queen h3 is a mate, and white has no defense to this mate. So in this position, what to brief this position, I mean, to summarize it, what we did was we saw that our king is safe. We saw the weaknesses, all the light squares, and we directly pounced on the light squares. We got all our pieces into the attack. We attacked the light squares, and in the end, the attack was so strong that our opponent could not try to defend it. So guys, I hope in this video I've been able to explain to you that how to use the weak squares in your attack when your opponent has weak squares, how to exploit the weak squares, how to give a do a crushing attack and crush your opponent. So guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And guys, we still have a couple of more videos, so guys, stay tuned and see you in the next video where we talk about some tactics and some checkmating plans before we end this playlist on the fundamental principles of attacking fearlessly. So see you in the next video, guys. Thank you for watching.